Welcome back to another installment of 4K on a budget. This time I'm taking the reins for an episode focused on the need for speed. As always, the challenge is simple. Aim for a native 4K resolution at a stable frame rate using budget hardware. 60 frames per second is the goal, but provided the frame rate is stable enough, we can settle for 30 frames per second instead. It just needs to be rock solid to be considered a success. This time around then, the budget PC in question is this bad boy, the venerable i5 3570K running at stock speeds, paired with a GTX 970 with an overclock. Oh yeah, living that fatality lifestyle on a budget. The GTX 970 is running with a 200 MHz core clock adjustment and 500 MHz adjustment to the memory. Alright, so what's on the menu today then? We're starting with Criterion's first shot at Need for Speed from 2010, with the re-envisioned Hot Pursuit. This will be followed by 2012's Most Wanted, also from Criterion, with 2013's Need for Speed Rivals behind that, before finishing up with the most recent installment just called The Need for Speed. Can the budget PC pull it off? Let's find out. Released almost 7 years ago then, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit was designed first and foremost for last generation consoles, and surprisingly its visuals hold up rather well on the PC in 2017. This is still a fast, beautiful game, and a lot of fun to play. So let's start by going straight for that full native 4K presentation with all settings cranked up. Hopping into a race here, you'll notice that the UI elements are kinda dated, being designed for 720p, but as we get into the game here at least, things start looking up. It's an older game, yes, but I think this looks pretty darn nice. One disappointing aspect though is the lack of adjustable options. I'm running here with post-process anti-aliasing and forced anisotropic filtering, but as you can see, these are not even available in the options menu. Thankfully, you can easily inject one of the available post-process varieties without any real cost of performance, or go for something a little more expensive like sparse grid super sampling. Unfortunately, in this case, the sparse grid solution is just too much for the poor 970 when targeting these high resolutions. But that's the beauty of PC gaming. You can decide for yourself where to make cuts or changes. If you fancy a lower resolution with SGSSAA then, you can certainly do it. For us though, we're sticking with the post-process solution, and really, it looks very nice at 4K, doesn't it? Despite its age, it does benefit from this very high resolution. The track design is focused more on large-scale scenes that stretch way out into the horizon, and I think the extra clarity you get from 4K resolution sorta helps draw you closer into the scene. It also makes it easier to spot upcoming turns and dodge incoming traffic. One of my favorite tracks has to be this one, where you're racing along the side of the coast. You've got the nice shiny road effect from the water and rain. You've got beautiful lighting coming in. It all looks just awesome in motion, especially with this high resolution. The colors are so vibrant. Of course, things went so well at this point that I considered bumping up the resolution further using NVIDIA DSR, but unfortunately that was just too much for the system to handle. Ah well, 4K is enough I think for this game. So this is clearly going to be the least demanding game, but what about 2012's Most Wanted? This was the second Criterion attempt at the franchise after all, and it sees us move to a large urban environment. Let's load this up and see what we get then with the default settings. And unfortunately, as I feared, it looks like the frame rate isn't all that stable at all. VSync is enabled, but double buffered, so if we can't hit 60 frames per second, it just drops to 30, which is half the refresh rate. So really, the game is mostly locking to 30 here, but you see these kind of jumps to 60 that wind up feeling awful while you're playing. Clearly, this isn't going to cut it, so let's try this instead. I'm going to use NVIDIA's half refresh rate feature to aim for 30 frames per second, as opposed to 60. This is always a great tool for getting a nice even level of performance with proper frame pacing, at least in most cases. So back to the game and, whoa, okay, this is not good at all. Getting a little concerned here. It would seem that video playback is now completely broken with the 30 FPS cap engaged, which is just lovely. Oh well, at least the loading screen looks a little better here, I'll give it that. Alright, here we go then. So right now I'm using the half refresh with adaptive VSync with settings pushed up. It's better than before for sure, but we're getting some minor screen tearing and slowdown here. Clearly, there is still some work to be done. We'll get to the settings adjustments in the game in a moment, but first I wanted to take a quick look at the game's configuration file. Alright, so let's try opening up the configuration file then. There are some options in here to play with. It's been a while for me, but it's all sort of starting to come back here. Okay, let's make these changes then and go back and see what happens. The introduction movie is still bad, but hey. Alright, back on the roads then, here we go. We're driving around and you can see that it does actually look rather nice overall. Dated in some ways, yes, of course, for a 5-year-old game, but I think it's rather attractive. The last thing necessary to smooth out the game fully though lies in the settings. I had to drop shadows to medium, reduce the VFX a little bit, and geometry at medium as well. It doesn't have a dramatic impact on visuals thankfully, and it does help avoid judder. I'm not going to show everything I did here, but I did drive around for a solid 30 minutes using these settings, and generally speaking, we're looking at a very locked 30 frames per second now. Much better, I think. The 4K resolution definitely helps improve the game as well, since it is a very fast game as you can see, and thinking back to last gen consoles at 720p, or even the Vita, which was a lot lower than that, having this high resolution makes it a lot easier to see what's coming up ahead. The environments are rather dense and traffic just sort of pops out of nowhere, so it's nice to be able to get an idea of what you have to tackle coming up. But still, honestly, 30 frames per second isn't really great for this game. It just doesn't feel as good to play, so let's go ahead and uncap the frame rate again and try messing with the settings. This time I'm actually dialing down some of the settings, turning shadows to low for instance, disabling ambient occlusion, things you normally wouldn't want to do, but, well, take a look. This is a lot better actually, and even with those settings turned down, the game still looks pretty darn good, I'd say. Driving across here, it does feel like it's going to be able to hold, and oh well, there's a crash there, and yeah, you can see when all the smoke and alpha effects pop up, it does still drop, so let's dial down things even further, drop the VFX to low, and give it another shot, and well, this seems pretty good thus far. Even with crashing and doing a nice donut here in the intersection with all the smoke popping up, we're still holding a solid 60 frames per second at a full 4K. Okay, so clearly there are two paths you can take with this game then. If you go for slightly above medium settings, cap the frame rate 30 frames per second, make the right I&I changes, and use the half refresh vertical sync option, you can enjoy the game with most of its effects at 4K 30. However, if you're willing to dial things back even further, you can instead play at 4K 60. So it's really just a matter of choice here. But considering that the lower settings don't really seem to greatly impact the overall visual experience, I'm feeling like the 60 frames per second option is the way to go here. Still, in the end, I kind of feel like Need for Speed Most Wanted is not the most optimized of PC games, and in fact if you go back to various old threads started around the time of release, you can see that many users were also very disappointed with the performance of the game compared to Hot Pursuit. Alright, so 2 games down, and both can do 4K 60, but of course Most Wanted requires extra tweaking and a loss in detail to get there. So, how about Need for Speed Rivals then? Rivals launched alongside the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One back in 2013, but on PC, it was notorious for its 30 frames per second cap. Thankfully, it is possible to unlock that with a command line option. So if we input that and start up the game, let's see what happens. Here's the thing about that trick though that I quickly discovered. If you set the game logic to run at 60 frames per second along with the frame rate, you cannot drop frames, otherwise the entire speed of the game is impacted. So what we're seeing here is performance above 30 but below 60 FPS with gameplay running slower than it should be. Frostbite does have significantly more overhead however, so I'm not too surprised that we're getting these results, but hey, this is even with all settings at the lowest possible settings, and it just doesn't work. So let's remove those commands and re-enable the half refresh rate vertical sync option and try again. Straight away, this is much better. Yes, it's only 30 frames per second, but frame pacing is correct, and it looks pretty good. We can increase the details here somewhat without going over budget as well, which is nice. Now this is the kind of game that got lost in the shuffle of launch day back then, but it still holds up pretty well, I think. Rivals is the second game in the series to make the jump over to Frostbite, for instance, the first being the not-so-great Need for Speed The Run, which we're not taking a look at today. And really though, I gotta say, this does look nice. I mean, look at this scene here. The trees, the lighting, it's all rather vibrant and just lovely to behold. Not bad for a 2013 racing game. I also think this one benefits greatly from 4K, much like Hot Pursuit did, in that there's a lot of wide open areas where you need to make quick decisions, and being able to see clearly ahead of you really does help. Plus, there's a lot of extra detail visible as well, which is nice.
I think at this point then, the budget PC is doing pretty well for itself. This is significantly better than what you could get with the console versions of the game, though to be fair, there aren't any patches for the updated versions of those consoles, and it's pretty likely that the Xbox One X could easily run this game at a native 4K as well. I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll see a patch for it though.
What have we got next? Our last game of the day is just called The Need for Speed. Oh, sorry, without the, it's just Need for Speed.
Say what you will about the game itself, but I kind of think it's one of the best looking racing games on the market. The lighting and materials are truly outstanding here and elevate the game to the next level. It relies heavily on post-processing effects to achieve its rather filmic look, which often includes integration of film sequences with real-time 3D. But I'm not expecting a lot from our budget PC here. With all of the options set to Ultra and the resolution at 4K, let's jump in and, well, yeah, okay, this isn't very smooth at all. Yikes. Yep, as you can see, things get pretty chunky at points. This crash looks like it's actually going to crash the system as well. So my first thought here is that perhaps it's a VRAM issue, since the 970 doesn't really have access to the full 4GB of VRAM at maximum speed, so let's try turning down the texture detail. And okay, that does seem to help make things run a little bit better, but still, the results here are not entirely smooth, so we have to go even lower. And dropping the settings all the way down, well, it's better still. Not too bad, really, but it's not perfect enough. It seems that this is one game where native 4K at a stable frame rate is off the table. And keep in mind, the 970 is overclocked right now, so there really isn't a lot of headroom left here. So when running at these lowest settings then, yeah, you can get something that's playable, but it's definitely not locked, which kind of disqualifies it from 4K on a budget victory.
So for this one, I decided it was time to use the custom resolution utility from ToastyX. Richard had great luck with this in a previous video, so let's give it a shot.
Let's go with 3200 by 1800 then, or 1800p for short. Just input the values here like so, and it should work right away after you run the restart program. Alright, so let's see how this runs then. Here we are with Ultra settings enabled, and well, this is pretty good. The frame rate seems extremely stable at this point, and the game still looks great. Honestly, the soft filmic presentation of the game doesn't require the pixel perfect look of native 4K to look nice, and 1800p is still a nice boost over 1440p or lower, and of course that means it's a big boost over the console versions. Compared to the other games, I think this is one where the absolute sharpness just doesn't really make a big difference. I mean, native 4K, it would have been nice, and you saw earlier what it looked like, but the style of the visuals really does work at this resolution. It's a great looking game. Still, this is just at 30 frames per second. If you want more than that, like 60 frames per second in these games, you're just going to have to sacrifice a lot of resolution or upgrade to a not so budget GPU. There's just no way that the 970 can handle this one at higher resolutions and frame rates.
So there we have it, 4 Need for Speed games all looking excellent on the budget PC. Looking back, Hot Pursuit really sticks out to me as it's a 7-year-old game at this point and really does benefit greatly from 4K at 60 frames per second. Though I suppose what wouldn't, right? But still, the long draw distances just work really well with this resolution, and the art direction in this game is still fantastic. Compared to the 720p 30 frames per second console releases back in the day, it really is a huge leap. It also requires no real fiddling to get going, it just kind of works. Most Wanted is far and away the most frustrating then, and it does not run as well as it should. It required the most effort, and I'm still not all that happy with the results. It feels like a game that should be 60 frames per second on this PC at 4K with all options enabled, but honestly, you know, we still got decent performance, it's just not where it should be. Rivals in 2015 then were the most surprising, as you can get exceptional results out of these newer games on moderate hardware. Yes, dropping to 1800p at 30 frames per second seems like a pretty significant sacrifice to make, but that's just the reality of targeting higher resolutions on a GTX 970 in a newer game like this. But anyways, that's all I have for now. If you're still in the mood for some more Need for Speed though, and haven't watched it, be sure to go back and check out the DF Retro episode I did on the very first Need for Speed game for 3DO and other older consoles. But if you enjoyed this video then, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter as always. And until next time, this is John signing off.